A wealthy man assumed firing his maid was the end of the story. The next day, she was revealed as the primary investor in his competitor's project. The Grayson mansion stood shrouded in darkness, its grand facade looming against the evening sky like a fortress guarding secrets. Inside, the stillness was broken only by the faint hum of the central heating and the measured ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the main hall. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and expensive leather, a combination that spoke of both power and meticulous control. But tonight, the atmosphere carried a different weight, one of tension, unspoken accusations, and inevitable change. At the far end of the mansion, in Dylan Grayson's office, the tension had reached its peak. The room was a testament to wealth and precision. An oak desk dominated the space, flanked by walls lined with leather-bound books. A single desk lamp cast a pool of golden light, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Dylan sat behind the desk, his tailored suit pristine, his expression as cold and unyielding as the marble floors beneath him. Clara Montgomery stood just inside the door, her fingers clutched tightly around the strap of her worn leather handbag. She had dressed carefully for this meeting, as she always did. Her black dress was modest but neat, her hair swept into a tidy bun. But now, standing before her employer, she felt small, exposed. The confidence she'd carried for years as the trusted steward of the Grayson estate seemed to evaporate under Dylan's steely gaze. "Do you know why I called you here, Clara?" His voice was calm, deliberate, yet it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the silence. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, sir, I don't." Dylan leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied her. "You've been with me for a long time," he began. 5 years, isn't it?" "Yes, sir. 5 years. In that time, I've come to rely on you more than most." His tone was measured, almost clinical. "You've had access to every corner of this house, every detail of my life, both personal and professional. I trusted you, Clara." Her throat tightened. "And I've always done my job with loyalty and care, Mr. Grayson. I hope you know that." "Do I?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. He rose from his chair and began pacing slowly, his movements deliberate. "Recently, certain irregularities have come to my attention. Sensitive information has been leaked, details that only someone inside this house could know." Clara's breath caught. "You think I'm responsible?" He stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "The leaks coincide with your access, Clara, your movements, your proximity to confidential matters." Her mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of the accusation. "Mr. Grayson, I swear to you, I would never betray your trust. I've dedicated myself to this household, to ensuring everything runs smoothly. If there have been leaks, I assure you, they didn't come from me." Dylan's expression didn't soften. "I wish I could believe that," he said quietly. "But the evidence points otherwise." "What evidence?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Have I ever given you a reason to doubt me? Even once?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he returned to his desk, placing both hands on its surface as he leaned forward. "It's not just about evidence, Clara. It's about risk. I can't afford uncertainty. Not now." Clara felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. "So that's it? You're willing to throw away 5 years of loyalty based on suspicion and coincidence?" Dylan straightened, his face impassive. "This isn't personal. It's a matter of protecting what I've built." She stared at him, disbelief and fury battling for dominance. "Not personal," she repeated, her voice shaking. "I've given everything to this job. Early mornings, late nights, holidays spent here instead of with my family. And now, you're telling me it doesn't matter?" His gaze flickered, but he quickly masked any sign of doubt. "You'll leave tonight," he said, his tone final. "Quietly. No need to make this harder than it has to be." Clara's lips parted, as though she wanted to argue, but then she closed them again. She realized there was no point. Dylan Grayson had made up his mind, and nothing she could say would change it. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "I'll leave," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But I'll tell you this, Mr. Grayson. Loyalty isn't something you can buy or dismiss on a whim. One day, you'll regret this. For a moment, something flickered in Dylan's expression. Regret, perhaps, or doubt. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. Clara's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she left the office. The mansion's grand hallways felt eerily empty, the usual warmth she associated with them replaced by a cold detachment. As she passed the staircase, she paused, looking up at the intricate chandelier that hung like a jewel in the center of the house. She had admired its beauty countless times, but now it felt like a symbol of everything she was leaving behind. Steeling herself, she continued to the front doors. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped outside, her breath forming faint clouds in the crisp autumn air. She turned to look back at the mansion, its windows glowing faintly against the darkness. For a moment, she felt a pang of sadness. This place had been her world for so long, but now it felt like a prison she was finally escaping. Inside the office, Dylan remained by the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched Clara's figure retreat into the night. A part of him wanted to call her back, to reconsider, but he shoved the thought aside. This was the right decision, he told himself. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment, not with so much at stake. Yet as the silence of the house enveloped him, a gnawing doubt crept into his mind. Had he been too hasty? Had he let his paranoia drive away someone who had been loyal to him? The questions lingered, unspoken but persistent. And as Clara disappeared down the driveway, the seeds of a chain of events that neither of them could foresee were quietly taking root. The morning sun rose reluctantly over the Grayson estate, casting long shadows across its manicured lawns. Inside, the house seemed unnaturally quiet, its usual rhythm broken. The absence of Clara Montgomery's presence lingered like a ghost in every corner. The faint sound of silverware against china in the dining room felt hollow, devoid of the usual efficiency and warmth Clara brought to the household. Dylan Grayson sat at the head of the long dining table, the breakfast spread before him untouched. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, a rare deviation from his usual immaculate appearance. He toyed with the edge of his coffee cup, his piercing blue eyes staring into the distance as if searching for something unseen. Despite his outwardly calm demeanor, his thoughts churned with unease. The decision to dismiss Clara the night before should have brought him clarity, a sense of control restored. Instead, it left an unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. He told himself it was necessary, that her dismissal had been inevitable. Yet, the image of her walking out the front door replayed in his mind like a film stuck on loop. He had built his life on precision and decisiveness, but for the first time in years, doubt gnawed at him. The moment was broken by the soft click of approaching footsteps. Robert, his trusted assistant, entered the room holding a tablet, his expression guarded. "Good morning, sir," Robert began, though his tone lacked its usual crispness. Dylan didn't respond immediately, instead gesturing for him to speak. "There's something you should see," Robert said, sliding the tablet across the table. Dylan glanced at the screen, his brows furrowing as he read the bold headline splashed across a news site. Grayson's former employee seen at Elliot Marks' estate. Is she the key to his downfall? Below it was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. Clara, stepping out of a sleek black limousine, her figure poised and composed despite the cameras flashing around her. Dylan's grip on the tablet tightened. "What is this?" His voice was calm, but the undertone of anger was impossible to miss. "It was taken last night," Robert said, hesitating as if weighing his next words. "Shortly after she left here. Witnesses say she spent time at Elliot Marks' estate." The name alone was enough to send a spark of tension through Dylan's frame. Elliot Marks, his greatest rival, a man whose charm and ruthlessness had made him both a formidable opponent and a perpetual thorn in Dylan's side. For years, Elliot had sought to undermine him at every turn, often through methods that were as cunning as they were underhanded. And now, Clara, the woman Dylan had trusted above most, was being linked to him. "Unbelievable," Dylan muttered, leaning back in his chair. His mind raced, piecing together the implications. She didn't waste any time, did she? Robert shifted uneasily. "It might not be what it seems, sir." Dylan's gaze snapped to him. "And what exactly does it seem, Robert?" "That she walked out of here and straight into the arms of the man who would stop at nothing to destroy me? Tell me, how else should I interpret this?" Robert fell silent, his discomfort evident. Dylan sighed, running a hand through his hair. The doubts that had whispered at the edges of his mind the night before now roared like a storm. Had Clara betrayed him all along? Was her loyalty a facade? Or was this something else entirely? "Find out everything," Dylan ordered, his voice low and deliberate. Who she spoke to, what she was doing there, and why she's suddenly in Mark's orbit. Robert nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll have a report by the afternoon." As Robert left the room, Dylan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his hands steepled under his chin. Clara's departure had felt abrupt, wrong even, but now it carried the weight of betrayal. He replayed their confrontation in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed, a hesitation, a slip, anything that would confirm his suspicions. But no matter how he turned it over, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something. Later that day, Dylan sat in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his success. The imposing bookshelves, the modern art lining the walls, the faint scent of leather and mahogany. But his mind wasn't on the empire he had built. It was on the image of Clara stepping out of that limousine. The buzz of his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Robert. "I've got something," Robert said, his tone cautious. "Go on," Dylan replied. The driver of the limousine, Robert began, was surprisingly willing to talk. "I reached out anonymously, and he said Clara didn't go into Mark's house." Dylan frowned. "Then why was she there?" The driver mentioned that she seemed tense. He overheard her on a phone call, something about not having a choice. That's all he could offer. The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into Dylan's chest. "Not having a choice," he repeated softly. His mind raced with possibilities. Was Clara being coerced? Had Marks cornered her in some way? Anything else? Dylan asked, his voice sharper now. "Not yet, sir, but I'm following up," Robert said. "I thought you should hear this first." Dylan ended the call, his thoughts spinning. The image of Clara, the composed, competent woman he had known for years, didn't align with the idea of someone being used as a pawn. Yet the alternative was equally unsettling, that she had willingly aligned herself with Marks. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the estate. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds, and for a moment, he felt a pang of loneliness. The house, once a well-oiled machine under Clara's management, now felt disjointed, as though her absence had thrown everything off balance. That evening, as Dylan nursed a glass of whiskey in his study, he found himself scrolling through news articles about Marks, about the supposed rivalry that the media loved to dramatize. But it wasn't the articles that held his attention. It was the comments beneath them. Classic Marks move. Get to the people closest to Grayson. Chip away from the inside. She must have seen the writing on the wall. Grayson's losing his edge. If Grayson can't even keep his own staff, how can he manage an empire? The words stung, not because they were entirely unfounded, but because they echoed his own fears. He had built his life on control, on knowing every piece of the game board. But now, it felt as though the pieces were moving without him. As the night deepened, Dylan made a decision. He couldn't afford to wait for answers to come to him. If Clara had betrayed him, he needed to know why. And if she hadn't, he needed to understand what had driven her into Mark's orbit. Either way, the truth wouldn't wait. The Grayson estate, once a symbol of unshakable authority and precision, now felt like a maze of uncertainty. Dylan sat in his office, the polished oak desk before him cluttered with files and papers. His coffee sat untouched, its heat dissipating as his focus drifted. Every decision he'd made over the past few weeks now seemed to unravel before his eyes, and Clara Montgomery's absence loomed larger than he had anticipated. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of leather filling the silence, and stared at the framed cityscape painting on the wall. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to read people, to anticipate betrayal before it struck. Yet Clara's departure, paired with the news of her presence at Elliot Mark's estate, left him grappling with doubts that felt foreign and unwelcome. A soft knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice sharp. Robert stepped inside, tablet in hand. His expression was serious, the usual deference in his demeanor replaced by unease. "Sir, I followed up on the lead about the limousine driver." Dylan gestured for him to sit, his piercing gaze fixed on his assistant. "And?" Robert hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablet. The driver confirmed Clara didn't enter Mark's estate. She was dropped at the gates and left shortly after. Dylan's eyes narrowed. "And the call? What did he overhear?" "Just fragments," Robert admitted. "She mentioned not having a choice, but beyond that, there's nothing concrete." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Dylan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "So, she wasn't meeting with Marks directly?" "It doesn't seem that way," Robert said cautiously. "But the question remains, why was she there at all? And why in such a public manner?" Dylan drummed his fingers against the desk, his mind working through the possibilities. Clara had been many things during her years of service: efficient, discreet, and fiercely loyal. None of those traits aligned with the image of her stepping out of a limousine for all to see. "Anything else?" Dylan asked, his voice tight. "There's a media narrative starting to build," Robert replied, scrolling through his tablet. "Articles speculating about her role in Mark's strategy against you. And worse, commentary about your judgment in dismissing her." Dylan's jaw clenched. The last thing he needed was the press feeding on this situation, spinning it into a spectacle that could damage his reputation further. "Shut it down," he ordered. "I don't care what it takes. Contain the story." Robert nodded, but his hesitation didn't go unnoticed. "Sir, if I may, perhaps it's worth considering the possibility that Clara isn't the enemy here." Dylan's gaze darkened. "What are you implying?" "I'm saying that dismissing her may have been premature," Robert said carefully. "If Marks is involved, he's a master manipulator. It's possible Clara's being used as a pawn." The idea gnawed at Dylan, though he refused to let it show. He had dismissed Clara to protect his interests, to ensure there were no vulnerabilities within his inner circle. But if Robert's theory held any weight, then his decision might have played directly into Mark's hands. "Keep digging," Dylan said finally. "I want every detail: where she's been, who she's spoken to, and any connection she might have to Marks." "Yes, sir," Robert said, standing to leave. "I'll update you as soon as I have more." When the door closed behind him, Dylan exhaled slowly, his frustration mounting. He turned to the window, his reflection staring back at him, and felt the weight of his own doubts pressing down. Had he miscalculated? Or worse, had he let paranoia blind him to the truth? As the hours passed, Dylan found himself pacing the halls of the mansion, a restless energy driving him. The staff moved with their usual efficiency, but he caught their sidelong glances, their whispered conversations that stopped the moment he entered a room. Clara's absence had unsettled them too, though none dared to say it outright. By late afternoon, Dylan returned to his office, determined to make sense of the chaos. He pulled up his secure files, reviewing every instance of leaked information over the past few months. Patterns began to emerge. Details that had seemed insignificant at the time now stood out with alarming clarity. The leaks had been targeted, precise. Meetings disrupted, deals sabotaged, trust eroded. And always, the timing pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of his operations. Dylan's suspicion of Clara had stemmed from her proximity to the information, but now, he saw gaps in that logic. The leaks had continued even during times when Clara had been absent or preoccupied with household matters. A thought struck him, chilling in its implication. What if the true source of betrayal wasn't Clara at all? His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Robert. "I've got something," Robert said, his tone urgent. "Clara's movements over the past week, there's a pattern. She's been meeting with someone regularly, but it's not Marks." Dylan's grip on the phone tightened. "Who?" "Jordan," Robert replied, the name landing like a thunderclap. Jordan had been one of Dylan's closest associates for years, a man he trusted implicitly. They met twice last week, both times at neutral locations. Dylan's mind raced. Jordan's access to confidential information rivaled Clara's. If he were involved in the leaks, it would explain everything. The precision, the timing, the deflection onto Clara. Do we know what they discussed? Dylan asked, his voice cold. Not yet, Robert said, but there's more. Clara visited a bank 2 days ago, and from what I've gathered, it wasn't for personal reasons. The timing lines up with her dismissal and the media frenzy that followed. Dylan's thoughts churned. Clara's connection to Jordan, her cryptic visits, the phone call overheard in the limousine. All of it painted a picture he couldn't yet decipher. But one thing was clear. Clara's involvement was far more complex than he had assumed. Find Jordan, Dylan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I want answers now. That evening, Dylan sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. His mind replayed the events of the past few days, each revelation peeling back another layer of uncertainty. He thought of Clara, of the defiance in her eyes during their confrontation, the quiet strength she had carried even as he dismissed her. He had been so certain of her guilt, so confident in his judgment. But now, those certainties were crumbling, leaving him with questions he didn't want to face. As the firelight danced across the room, Dylan made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth about Clara, about Jordan, about the forces conspiring against him. And when he did, he would ensure that no one, not even Elliot Marks, could dismantle what he had built. For now, though, he could only wait for the pieces to fall into place. But waiting had never been Dylan Grayson's strength. The grand ballroom of the Five Seasons Hotel was a vision of opulence, its gilded ceilings reflecting the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. The city's elite gathered in clusters, their laughter and murmured conversations filling the space with an air of cultivated sophistication. Waitstaff glided through the crowd, trays of champagne balanced with practiced ease. It was a setting where power plays were veiled in charm, and alliances shifted with the clink of glasses. Dylan Grayson stood at the edge of the room, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his tie perfectly knotted. He held a glass of whiskey, but he barely tasted it. His focus was on the man across the room, Elliot Marks. The rival who had haunted his career for years was in his element, surrounded by admirers. Mark's laugh was loud, his gestures expansive, his presence magnetic in a way that grated on Dylan's nerves. Tonight, Elliot was more than just a rival. He was the man who might hold the key to unraveling the mystery that had consumed Dylan since Clara's departure. Dylan's jaw tightened as his gaze swept over the room. He had come to the gala with a purpose, one he couldn't afford to fail at. His thoughts flickered to Clara, her sharp words during their last conversation, the photograph of her stepping out of Mark's limousine, the cryptic phone call overheard by the driver. Every piece of the puzzle seemed to point back to the man who now stood laughing, oblivious to the storm brewing across the room. Mr. Grayson, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Robert, his assistant, who had been quietly observing the room alongside him. What is it? Dylan asked, his tone clipped. Robert hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Mark's. He's been watching you, sir. Subtle but deliberate. Dylan smirked faintly, the expression more bitter than amused. Of course he has. The question is, why? Robert shifted uncomfortably. Do you want me to intervene? No, Dylan said, draining his glass and setting it on a nearby tray. I'll handle this myself. With deliberate strides, Dylan crossed the ballroom, weaving through the clusters of guests who parted instinctively to let him pass. As he approached Mark's circle, the rival billionaire turned, his expression shifting into a smile that was as sharp as it was insincere. Dylan, Marks greeted, extending a hand. I was wondering when you'd make your way over. You're not one to linger in the shadows. Dylan shook his hand, his grip firm, his smile faint and equally false. Elliot, you're as charming as ever. The group around Marks exchanged glances, sensing the tension, and began to disperse under the pretense of refilling glasses or mingling elsewhere. Soon, it was just the two of them, the room's hum of conversation receding into the background. To what do I owe the pleasure? Marks asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp with curiosity. Dylan didn't waste time. Let's cut the pleasantries, Elliot. We both know you're not here to admire the decor. Marks chuckled, swirling the champagne in his glass. True. But then, neither are you. Then let's get to it, Dylan said, his voice dropping. What's your game? Elliot raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. Game? Dylan, you give me far too much credit. I'm simply here to enjoy the evening, just like everyone else. Dylan's patience wore thin. Don't insult me, Elliot. Clara, the limousine. The conveniently timed photo splashed across the headlines. That wasn't a coincidence, and we both know it. Mark's smirk widened, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Ah, Clara. She's been quite the topic of conversation lately, hasn't she? Why was she at your estate? Dylan demanded, his voice low but edged with steel. Marks took a deliberate sip of his champagne, savoring the moment before answering. Let's just say she and I had mutually beneficial meeting. Dylan's fists clenched at his sides. If you think you can use her against me, you're making a mistake. Marks tilted his head, studying Dylan with the air of a cat toying with its prey. You assume too much. Clara came to me because she had no other choice. And if you truly knew her, you'd understand why. Dylan's breath hitched at the implication. What are you talking about? Marks leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. You cast her out, Dylan, without a second thought. And when you did, you left her vulnerable. I merely offered her a path forward. The word stung more than Dylan wanted to admit. He searched Mark's face for deceit, but the man's composure was infuriatingly unshaken. If you're trying to turn her against me, it won't work. Marks chuckled again, a sound that grated on Dylan's nerves. Turn her against you? Dylan, she doesn't need me to do that. You managed that all on your own. The statement landed like a punch, but Dylan refused to let it show. Whatever you think you're doing, Elliot, it won't work. Clara's smarter than you give her credit for. I know exactly how smart she is, Mark said, his tone shifting to something colder, more serious. And that's why you should be worried. Clara isn't the pawn you think she is. In fact, she might be the only reason you're still standing. Dylan froze, the weight of the words sinking in. Before he could respond, Mark straightened, his smirk returning. I'd love to stay and chat, but I believe my date's waiting for me. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Dylan. With that, Marks turned and walked away, leaving Dylan standing amidst the glittering crowd, his thoughts swirling. The confrontation had yielded no clear answers, only more questions. What did Marks mean about Clara protecting him? And why had she gone to him at all? As the evening wore on, Dylan found himself retreating to a quieter corner of the ballroom, nursing another drink as he replayed the encounter in his mind. Mark's words gnawed at him, their implications impossible to ignore. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he had misjudged Clara, not just in her loyalty, but in her role in the chaos that now surrounded him. The weight of his own decisions pressed down on him, heavier than the crystal chandeliers overhead. He had come to the gala seeking answers, but all he had found were more doubts. And as the night drew on, one thing became clear. If he wanted the truth, he would have to seek it from the source. The rain came down in steady sheets as Dylan Grayson stepped out of his car onto the wet pavement of 8th Street. The cafe's glowing sign, muted by the drizzle, flickered faintly above the doorway, casting a warm but subdued light onto the sidewalk. He tugged the collar of his overcoat higher against the chill and took a steadying breath. This meeting, unplanned and unexpected, was his first step toward clarity or confrontation. Inside, the cafe was modest and quiet, the kind of place where conversations were meant to be kept low. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the faint aroma of baked goods, a deceptive calm to the tension knotting in Dylan's chest. Near the corner window, Clara sat at a small table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Her gaze was fixed on the raindrops streaking down the glass, her profile composed but distant. Dylan hesitated, his hand hovering over the back of the chair opposite her. For a brief moment, he considered walking away, but the need for answers outweighed his doubts. He cleared his throat softly, and Clara turned, her expression guarded as her eyes met his. "You're early," she said, her voice even. though it lacked the warmth he once associated with her. "I wanted to be," Dylan replied, sliding into the seat. He noticed how her posture remained stiff, her shoulders squared as if preparing for a battle. "Clara, thank you for agreeing to meet." She gave a small nod but didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the soft clatter of cups and murmurs from other patrons. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. "Why did you call me, Dylan?" she asked, her tone measured. "I thought we said everything we needed to the last time we spoke." Dylan exhaled, his fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup the server had placed before him. "I thought so too. But things have changed." Clara arched an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her reserved demeanor. "Changed? You mean the part where I'm suddenly the centerpiece of tabloid headlines? Or the part where I'm seen as your enemy?" Dylan winced. "I didn't ask for any of that to happen." "No," she said, her voice sharp. "But you made it easy for others to think it." Her words landed with precision, forcing him to pause. He studied her carefully, noting the slight tension in her jaw, the way her hands remained tightly clasped around the cup. There was no malice in her tone, only a quiet resolve that made him realize just how deeply his actions had cut. "Clara," he began, leaning forward, "I made a mistake. I acted without thinking, and I let paranoia cloud my judgment. I shouldn't have fired you." Clara's expression softened slightly, but her guard didn't lower. "Why now, Dylan? Why the sudden change of heart? Because of the headlines? Or because you think you need me for something?" The accusation stung, but he didn't deny it. "Both," he admitted. "The headlines, the rumors, they're part of it. But more than that, I realized I might have been wrong about you. And I need to know the truth." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or the remnants of the trust they once shared. Finally, she sighed, setting her cup down with deliberate care. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Everything," Dylan replied. "Why you were at Elliot Mark's estate, what he wants, and most importantly, why you didn't tell me about any of this before it spiraled out of control." Clara shook her head, a wry smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Easier said than done." "Try me," Dylan said, his tone firm. Clara's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup as she collected her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a weight to her words that made Dylan sit up straighter. "Elliot didn't come to me," she said. "I didn't go to him willingly either. After you fired me, I was left with nothing. No job, no security, no plan. And just when I thought I'd hit rock bottom, Elliot Mark stepped in." Dylan's fists clenched under the table. "What did he offer you?" Clara glanced up, her eyes hardening. "A way to survive. He knew exactly when and how to find me, like he'd been waiting for this moment. He made it clear that he didn't care about me, not really. All he wanted was access to you." Dylan's stomach churned. "Access to me? Why?" "Because you're the one person he can't seem to beat," Clara said simply. "He wanted leverage, Dylan, and he thought I could be it." The words hung in the air like a sharp edge, cutting through the tension between them. Dylan's mind raced, piecing together everything Marks had said at the gala, every cryptic comment that now carried a sinister clarity. "And you refused," Dylan said, more a statement than a question. "Of course I did," Clara snapped, her eyes flashing. "But that didn't stop him. He threatened to ruin me if I didn't cooperate. Said he'd make it look like I'd been working with him all along." Dylan felt his chest tighten. "And that's why you were seen in the limousine?" Clara nodded. "He forced me to show up, knowing the cameras would be there. It was never about getting information from me. It was about creating the illusion of betrayal." The weight of her words pressed down on Dylan like a leaden cloak. He had been so quick to believe the worst of her, to dismiss her without question. And in doing so, he had played directly into Mark's hands. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Clara's expression softened, her anger giving way to something more vulnerable. "Because you didn't give me the chance. You didn't ask me what happened. You just assumed." Dylan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. She was right. He had made his judgment swiftly, without considering the person standing before him. The realization stung more than he cared to admit. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "I don't need an apology, Dylan. I need to know that if we're going to get through this, you'll trust me. No more assumptions. No more second-guessing." Dylan nodded, the sincerity in his expression undeniable. "You have my word." Clara leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "Good. Because if we're going to take down Elliot Marks, we're going to need a plan. And this time, we do it my way." For the first time in days, Dylan felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was far from clear, but with Clara by his side, he felt more prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the Grayson estate, painting the rooms in a golden light that felt at odds with the tension crackling in the air. Dylan Grayson paced his office, the rich wood floors creaking faintly under his precise steps. His mind churned with Clara's revelations from their meeting at the cafe. Elliot Marks had orchestrated a web of deception, but there was one piece of the puzzle that still eluded him, the true source of the betrayal within his inner circle. Clara had been right about one thing. The leaks, the chaos, all of it had started long before her dismissal. Someone close to Dylan had been feeding Marks, using Clara's position as a convenient scapegoat. Now, Dylan was determined to uncover the traitor and ensure they paid for their duplicity. The door to his office creaked open, and Clara stepped inside. She was no longer the housemaid he remembered. Her posture was straighter, her presence commanding in a way that surprised him. There was a quiet strength in her that hadn't been there before. "Robert has the files," Clara said, her tone all business. "He's cross-referencing access logs from the past 6 months. We're narrowing it down." Dylan nodded, his jaw tight. "Good. We don't have much time." Clara moved to the desk, placing a small stack of papers before him. "I've been going over the details myself. Whoever it is, they've been careful, almost too careful. The patterns don't align with a careless informant. This was deliberate." Dylan leaned over the desk, scanning the pages she provided. His eyes flicked over the dates and times of the leaks, each one corresponding to moments when he'd been at his most vulnerable. Meetings sabotaged, negotiations disrupted, confidential strategies leaked to competitors. It was a methodical takedown, and it had nearly succeeded. "This person isn't just working with Marks," Dylan said, his voice low. "They're trying to destroy me." Clara didn't flinch. "Then it's time we destroyed them first." Hours later, Dylan and Clara sat in a small, private conference room on the estate, the hum of a projector filling the space as Robert presented his findings. The assistant's normally composed demeanor was strained, his eyes darting nervously between Dylan and Clara. "There are 3 potential suspects," Robert began, clicking through a series of slides. "All of them have had access to key meetings and information during the timeline of the leaks." The first image flashed on the screen. An older woman with salt and pepper hair and a severe expression. Margaret Lane, head of legal. She's been with the company for over a decade and has handled all major contracts. If someone wanted to leak confidential terms, she'd be in the perfect position. Clara shook her head. "Margaret is meticulous, but she's loyal. She wouldn't jeopardize her reputation like this." Dylan nodded in agreement. "Next." The second image appeared, a younger man with sandy hair and an easy smile. "Jonathan Keene," Robert continued, "Director of Operations. He's been with us for 4 years, but there's a gap in his background. We couldn't verify all of his previous employment." Dylan frowned. "I've trusted Jonathan with major logistics. If it's him." He didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of his words lingered in the room. Finally, the third image filled the screen. A familiar face that sent a chill down Dylan's spine. "Jordan Lewis," Robert said, his voice hesitant. "Head of Finance. He's been with you since the beginning, sir. But he had significant contact with Marks before joining your company." Dylan's fists clenched at the name. Jordan had been more than just an employee. He had been a confidant, a trusted ally through years of growth and adversity. The idea that he could betray Dylan was almost unthinkable. Almost. "Do you have proof?" Dylan asked, his voice cold. Robert hesitated. "Not concrete, but but the patterns are damning. Jordan attended meetings where leaks originated, and his accounts show irregular transfers, small enough to avoid notice, but frequent. Dylan exchanged a glance with Clara, her expression unreadable. "It's him," she said quietly. "It fits too perfectly. He had access, motive, and the means to cover his tracks." Dylan stared at Jordan's photo, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Set up a meeting," he said, his voice steady. "I want to hear it from him." That evening, Jordan arrived at the estate, his easy confidence intact as he entered the conference room. He greeted Dylan with a broad smile, his handshake firm, as though he were unaware of the storm brewing around him. Clara stood silently in the corner, her presence a quiet reminder of the stakes. "Dylan," Jordan began, taking a seat. "What's this about? You seemed urgent." Dylan sat across from him, his expression cold. "I need to ask you a few questions, Jordan, about your role here, about your loyalty." Jordan's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Loyalty? Dylan, you know I've always been loyal to you. What's going on?" Dylan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Do I? Because for the past 6 months, someone's been leaking information, details that only a handful of people had access to, and all signs point to you." For the first time, Jordan's composure cracked. His eyes widened, his smile fading. "Me? That's absurd. Dylan, I would never." "Save it," Clara interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We've seen the patterns, Jordan. The meetings you attended, the accounts you've used. It all lines up." Jordan's gaze flicked to Clara, a flicker of disdain crossing his face. "Of course, you'd be involved in this," he sneered. "You've always had it out for me." Clara stepped forward, her tone unwavering. "This isn't about me, Jordan. It's about you betraying the man who trusted you." Jordan turned back to Dylan, his expression shifting to one of desperation. "Dylan, you can't seriously believe this. I've been with you from the beginning. We've built this company together." Dylan stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. "That's what makes this so difficult," he said quietly. "I trusted you, Jordan. But now, I have no choice but to ask, why?" Jordan's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might confess. But then his expression hardened, defiance replacing regret. "You want the truth, Dylan? Fine. Yes, I worked with Marks. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about survival. You've built this empire on trust, but the cracks have been showing for years. I saw an opportunity, and I took it." Dylan's jaw tightened, his anger barely contained. "You betrayed me. Everything we built, everything I gave you. And you threw it away for what? A payout?" Jordan shrugged, his defiance turning to smugness. "You can't win against Marks, Dylan. He's too smart, too connected. And you? You're too blinded by loyalty to see when someone's playing you." Dylan rose from his chair, his voice cold and unyielding. "Get out. You're done here." Jordan hesitated, as though weighing whether to argue. But the steel in Dylan's eyes left no room for negotiation. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out without another word. As the door closed behind him, Clara turned to Dylan. "Are you all right?" Dylan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "No," he admitted. "But we're one step closer to ending this." And as the night deepened, Dylan felt a renewed resolve. The battle wasn't over, but with Clara by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The morning sun was a pale specter as it rose over the city, its light diffused by the gray clouds that hung low in the sky. Dylan Grayson's office, normally a sanctuary of order and control, was now a battlefield of emotions. The confrontation with Jordan the night before had left lingering echoes of betrayal. Dylan sat at his desk, staring blankly at the skyline beyond the wide windows, the silence of the room pressing heavily on him. Clara entered without knocking, her steps firm but quiet. She placed a folder on his desk, her expression resolute. "I've gone through everything," she said. "Every account, every communication trail. Jordan's betrayal is worse than we thought." Dylan looked up, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. "Worse how?" Clara opened the folder, flipping to a page marked with red tabs. These are the transactions we tracked. Small enough to avoid suspicion, but consistent. And these, she pointed to another page, are the meetings he attended with key clients. In almost every case, information leaked immediately after. Dylan exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. How did I miss this? I've worked with him for years. Trusted him. Clara's voice softened, but her tone remained firm. Because you wanted to believe in the people closest to you. That's not a flaw, Dylan. But it's why Marks was able to exploit you. Dylan ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his posture. And now? Clara closed the folder. Now, we confront him publicly. Marks needs to see that you're not as vulnerable as he thinks. Dylan's brow furrowed. Publicly? Clara nodded. Marks thrives on perception. He's used the rumors, the headlines, the betrayals to weaken your image. If we expose Jordan and connect him directly to Marks, it'll shift the narrative. The logic was sound, but the weight of it settled heavily on Dylan. Public confrontations weren't his style. He had built his empire through quiet strategy, not spectacle. But this was a war Marks had started, and Dylan couldn't afford to fight it on his own terms anymore. Do it, Dylan said finally. Set it up. That evening, the boardroom of one of Dylan's downtown properties was transformed into a theater of reckoning. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, and the air was heavy with anticipation. Members of Dylan's inner circle had been called in under the guise of an urgent meeting, and Jordan was among them, his demeanor calm, almost smug. Clara stood by the door, her presence understated but commanding. She wore a tailored blazer, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the room as though cataloging every detail. Dylan sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. When the last attendee arrived, Dylan stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, he began, his voice steady. I've called this meeting to address a matter that affects not just me, but this entire organization. The room fell silent, the weight of his words drawing every eye to him. Over the past 6 months, Dylan continued, we've suffered a series of targeted leaks. These leaks have sabotaged deals, disrupted operations, and damaged our reputation. And they didn't happen by accident. A murmur rippled through the room, uncertainty and unease spreading like a current. Jordan's smile faltered, but he quickly masked it, leaning back in his chair with feigned nonchalance. We've traced the source, Dylan said, his eyes locking onto Jordan. And it's someone sitting in this room. The tension was palpable, the air thick with disbelief and suspicion. Jordan shifted slightly, his mask of confidence cracking just enough for Clara to catch it. Jordan Lewis, Dylan said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Jordan's eyes widened, but he quickly composed himself. What are you talking about? He said, his voice calm but edged with defensiveness. This is ridiculous. Clara stepped forward, placing the folder on the table. These are the records, she said, opening it to display the evidence. Bank transactions, communication logs, meeting schedules. Every piece points to you. The room erupted in murmurs, some voices incredulous, others accusatory. Jordan stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is a setup, he snapped, his composure slipping. You're taking the word of a disgraced maid over mine? Clara didn't flinch. Disgraced? Or someone you used to cover your tracks? Her voice was calm, but her words were like a whip, precise and unyielding. You knew I'd be an easy target. You fed Dylan enough doubt to push me out, knowing it would give you free rein. Jordan turned to Dylan, desperation creeping into his tone. Dylan, you can't seriously believe this. We've worked together for years. I've been loyal to you from the start. Dylan's gaze was cold, unrelenting. And that's what makes this betrayal worse. You didn't just leak information, Jordan. You tried to destroy everything we've built. Jordan's fists clenched, his face twisting with anger. You don't understand. Marks made it impossible to say no. He would have ruined me if I didn't cooperate, and so you decided to ruin me instead? Dylan's voice rose, his control slipping for the first time. You had a choice, Jordan, and you made the wrong one. Jordan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but found only cold stares. Clara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "It's over, Jordan. Marks can't protect you now." Jordan's face hardened, but he said nothing. He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving the room in silence. Dylan sat back down, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the confrontation. He glanced at Clara, who gave him a small nod, her expression unreadable. Later that night, Dylan stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights stretching out before him. The confrontation had been necessary, but it hadn't brought the relief he'd hoped for. The betrayal still lingered, a wound that wouldn't easily heal. Clara joined him, a glass of wine in hand. She didn't speak, but her presence was steady, grounding. After a moment, Dylan broke the silence. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Clara turned to him, her gaze steady. "We're not done yet, Dylan. Marks won't stop just because Jordan's out of the picture." Dylan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we finish it." For the first time in weeks, a sense of purpose settled over him. The path ahead was clear, and he wouldn't walk it alone. The Grayson estate was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, its manicured lawns and towering architecture taking on a golden hue. Inside, however, the air was charged with a mix of resolve and quiet tension. Dylan Grayson sat in his office, the weight of the past few weeks etched into the lines on his face. The confrontation with Jordan had closed one chapter but left another wide open. Elliot Marks still loomed as a threat, and there was no doubt he would retaliate. But tonight wasn't about Elliot. Tonight was about rebuilding. Clara stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had changed in ways Dylan was only beginning to understand. There was a confidence in her now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the events of the past weeks. It was the realization that she had survived them, emerged from the chaos with her integrity intact. Dylan cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Clara," he began, his tone softer than usual. "I owe you more than an apology." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You've already apologized, Dylan. Words don't mean much without action." He nodded, accepting the rebuke without argument. "You're right, and I intend to back them up. But first, I need to say this. I was wrong. About you, about everything. I let my fear cloud my judgment, and I made choices that hurt you." Clara studied him for a long moment, her arms crossed. "Do you know why that hurt so much?" she asked quietly. "Because I trusted you, too. I thought you knew me well enough to see through the lies." Dylan's chest tightened at her words. "I should have. I let Marks manipulate me, and in doing so, I became exactly what he wanted. A man who couldn't trust the people closest to him." Clara nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Good. At least you see it now." Dylan leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "I need your help, Clara. Not just to deal with Marks, but to rebuild what I've broken. You were more than just an employee here. You were the heart of this house." "I see that now." Clara's eyes softened, though her posture remained firm. "If I come back, Dylan, things have to change. No more assumptions, no more paranoia. If you want loyalty, you have to give it too." He met her gaze, his sincerity evident. "I promise you, Clara, I'll do better." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Clara nodded. "All right, let's finish this." Over the next week, Clara and Dylan worked side by side, their efforts focused on unraveling the remnants of Elliot Marks' schemes. Together, they rebuilt the trust that had been shattered, piece by piece. Clara's insight and resourcefulness proved invaluable, and Dylan found himself relying on her in ways he hadn't before, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. Marks, true to form, didn't go quietly. A series of strategic moves hinted at his continued interference, but with Jordan exposed and Clara's guidance, Dylan was prepared. They countered Marks' tactics with precision, turning the tide in their favor. The final blow came during a high-stakes negotiation that Marks had sought to sabotage. Clara, armed with information gathered through careful planning, exposed Mark's involvement in a deal that violated corporate ethics. The revelation not only discredited Mark's, but also restored Dylan's standing in the business community. When the dust settled, Dylan and Clara stood in his office, the tension that had defined the past few weeks finally lifting. "It's over," Dylan said, exhaling deeply. "For now," Clara replied, though there was a note of satisfaction in her voice. "Marks will recover." "He always does." Dylan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Then we'll be ready for him." The evening after their victory, the Grayson estate was alive with quiet celebration. The staff, many of whom had watched the events unfold from the sidelines, were visibly more at ease. Clara moved through the house with her usual efficiency, though this time, her presence was met with smiles and nods of gratitude. Dylan found her in the garden, standing near the rose bushes she had once tended with care. The cool evening air carried the faint scent of blossoms, a reminder of the serenity that had been missing for so long. "Clara," he called softly, stepping closer. She turned, her expression calm but curious. "What is it, Dylan?" He hesitated, then offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. For staying, for fighting when I didn't deserve it. I don't think I could have done this without you." Clara tilted her head slightly, her eyes thoughtful. "You're welcome. But don't forget, Dylan, it wasn't just for you. It was for me too. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't just a victim in all of this." Dylan nodded, his respect for her growing with each passing moment. "You've done more than prove that, Clara. You've shown me what it means to truly trust someone." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling into something lighter, something hopeful. "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" Dylan asked, his voice quiet. Clara smiled faintly. "Normal is overrated. Let's aim for better." Dylan chuckled, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "Better. I like that." As the evening deepened, the two of them stood side by side, the garden bathed in moonlight. It wasn't the end of the challenges they would face, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild. Not just what had been lost, but something stronger, something new. And for the first time in a long while, Dylan Grayson felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope.